So without further ado, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Mazourek, who is an associate professor of horticulture in the School of Integrated Plant Sciences at Cornell University. He's an associate professor of vegetable breeding and a pro bono co-founder of Row 7 Seed Company. Michael is coming to us from Ithaca today, and he's going to talk about matching breeds to production goals. So Michael, go ahead and share your screen, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. So glad to be here, and I'll share from my experience with vegetables in this region. I grew up in the Finger Lakes, have been growing a garden and increasingly larger scale productions at times of a set of vegetable varieties. I also have been doing plant breeding and research and extension on farm trials extensively for the past decade. And so I'll be speaking from the crops I've had the experiences in. You'll hear a lot about cucurbits, peppers, peas and beans, but I can also speak on some of the experiences we have that we can extend to other crops. So the focus today is trying to understand and what strategies to help look at what are the genetics available in crops, upcoming changes in the genetics of the cultivars you rely on, and thinking about how to best match them with your needs based on on-farm work we've done around New York State. Okay. So one of the key things when I start to look at the farms and what we're going to recommend, how we're going to strategize, is thinking about how someone's growing, the field and high tunnel are another important distinction. Looking at where you are. If you're outside of the Catskills, there's very different growing regions all through New York, and different strategies may or may not work for you. What you're growing for your CSA, or if you're doing market, restaurant, wholesale, all different decisions about how much you can explore what's out there. But really what we're going to talk today is about looking at the crop and the cultivar, and even how that might change looking at successions through the season. The best way I have to illustrate this is thinking about within our growing season, the seasons of cucurbit pests. And one of the ways I've strategized with people about what to grow when is thinking about what is the spectrum of challenges they'll face through the season. If you are growing heated, hydroponic, extended winter seasons, there's different challenges, but a similar set of like, what are you going to grow to fit your niche, right? And so this, I want to explore looking at the season of challenges and the best advice we have in how to address these, how to anticipate them, and maybe adjust your cultivars based on what's coming. Right, so I'll work through these in an order. So usually one of the first challenges I get phone calls and emails and photos for is angular leaf spot. Right? Angular is a bacterial disease. It can be introduced on seed. That's the most common way we've seen it introduced. You can build it up on your farm, but starting with clean seed seems to be the most critical, especially if you're organic IPM using row covers to protect against cucumber beetles or going really early in the season. That warm, wet, moist environment, it's bacterial. It really helps it grow. I'm not familiar with any curative things once it gets going, anything that's approved. There are things, bacterial suspensions that some people add that can help with this concept of getting an ecology of other bacteria that will compete with these going. But the most effective and something we do in our program is using a peroxide wash of the seed. I can tell people about it, but also your certifier will know about whether you can use oxidate, peroxyacetic acid. There's a number of things to help ensure the seed that's going into your fields under your row covers is clean. Sometimes you can catch it in the seedling tray, but otherwise, this is the typical crunchy bacterial. It looks like, the leafy greens that have been stored too long. A similar phenomenon is going on under a row cover. Right? But the biggest one, and when we survey growers about what should we be working on, striped cucumber beetles shows up as one of the top priorities every time. Conventional growers, people are using treated seeds, neonic sprays. There's potentially a concern about the timing of the sprays, as cucumber beetles love flowering cucurbits and the pollinators love flowering cucurbits. There's a tension there. And so genetic resistance is one of the ways to control it. People are using trap crops. There's some parasitoid wasps that are coming in. There's something like diatomaceous earth, and some OMRI-approved pesticides that can be effective, but still they can be a challenge to control. It doesn't necessarily have to be, and so what we're working toward is there are cultivars around on the marketplace, like this one on the top, Success PM, and a variety of crops that actually do really well against striped cucumber beetles, and others like the one at the bottom. These are plots grown side by side to show you with the genetics of the crop, you can get a great difference in how you control the pest. Right? And so our best guide for how you approach this is, we've done studies. Lauren Brzezowski and Brian Leckie in my group did publications a while ago looking at which crops have the most striped cucumber beetle damage. And we made this guide, and to the punchline for people that are really interested in the background of the cultivars they're growing. What is really going on here is there's two different genetic subgroups. There's the Cucurbit pepo texana, that's the straight neck summer squash, patty pans, crooknecks, acorn delicata. If you're growing those, that is a species of squash, a subspecies of squash that was domesticated in the southeastern US, where there's striped cucumber beetles. And these are crops that evolved with the beetles to be resistant. However, the Cucurbit pepo, so the jack-o'-lanterns and zucchini, that's something that was domesticated in around Mexico. And then zucchini actually is a crop that was developed from those seeds that made it to Europe and Italy and reintroduced into the US in the early 1900s. And so zucchini is a crop that never has had this history of evolving, adapting with the cucumber beetles. They annihilate it. And so if you're growing a mix of these crops on your farm, this can be a handy guide to know where to put some of your resources into protecting which crops. Right? And if you have the flexibility in your marketplace, if you're in a place where you can do narratives and storytelling about why you're growing what you are, in terms of what you see, there's not a huge difference between a straight neck summer squash like Success PM and a golden zucchini, which is one of the most preferred crops we found in squash. The beetles just love it. They will eat it to the ground. And so with these, these are the kind of exemplify the extremes of what you would have on your farm trying to grow summer squash. And just side by side again, this is really the challenge you're dealing with, is striped cucumber beetles. And so if you've been growing a straight neck or crook neck summer squash instead of zucchini, then your life is just a lot easier for all the controls you're doing, and also the buildup of these pests on your farm through the season. As you can see in these two time charts, these two black bars, they're going to show up, at least in the Finger Lakes, early June. They're going to decimate crops, lay eggs at the roots. Their larvae will eat the roots, and then you get a second wave in the fall. The August, September wave is not as strong, but it's something to be aware of, that any of these that you leave going in June and July are going to be what you get in August, and that's what's going to overwinter to come right back the next summer. Okay. Some alternatives, as we were doing work and we're breeding zucchinis that will be as resistant as that straight neck squash. If I go down to the southeast and talk to farmers, they will just tell me, no, 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 that's not going to help, because something that you might be experiencing too is the introduction of vine borers onto your farm. As they're migrating up, it's becoming more of an issue. They love maximas. They love all those peepos, summer squash and winter squash. But Cucurbita moschata is a species as butternut squash, cheese pumpkins, but also this very curved tromboncino squash. And what you might find from some companies that are specialized in seed for customers that have an Asian cultural market, like these avocado squash here. These are Cucurbita moschata in the butternut family, but they can be used as a summer squash. Some of them can be used dually as a summer squash and a winter squash. In the Southeast, places where vine borers are an issue, these are not necessarily immune, but it's really hard for the vine borers to get into these squash because these have a solid main stem. And so the vine borers, they can't drill in and then be in that hollow subway system of your plant to wreak havoc, because they are just confronted with this hard, almost woody tissue wherever they go, and they can't really do as much damage to the crop. Right. So as people have different approaches to control, we have found spinosades to be really effective, but they're kind of broad spectrum, like pyrethrins, the diatomaceous earths. We haven't been found to be effective. Row cover has its function. You're still using a lot of plastic on your farm. We would like to encourage a combination of growing the adapted squash, push-pull techniques, and looking to see a crop grown in early May. You can get it in, and it is a robust plant growing and putting out its fruit by the time the striped cucumber beetles get there. But if you're planting young crops into this in June, especially, it's something to probably prioritize how you're going to manage the damage. Looking at the effectiveness of a row cover, you can look, we have the yield per plant descending in this fruit per plant column. So the top two have row cover, right? And statistically, it's the same yield. You know, they're connected both by the letter A. And so golden zucchini, Success PM, these two extremes for cucumber beetle damage do the same if they've been protected by row cover removed at flowering. Success PM, the summer squash, does, you know, not quite as good as it is in the protected environment of row cover. And if you look at the damage next to it, it also doesn't really get any damage from the striped cucumber beetle. So it's getting a little boost from the heat of the row cover. You'll see warnings on row cover to avoid the row cover being on hot days. That's certainly true for brassicas, crops that don't like the heat. I've never found a circumstance where, as long as the plants have adequate water, the cucurbits haven't loved as much heat as you could possibly pack in. You might find exceptions, but for me, that's been our experience. Golden zucchini, though, if you look at it, without row cover, you're barely getting any yield, and that's because the plants are half gone. You know, looking in the field, we have some huge populations of cucumber beetles where we're at, and the Cornell research farms, and just side by side, after the row cover is off, you can see the difference of the Success PM without any damage, and the golden zucchini that wasn't protected, just gone. Right? And so this can inform how you will set up control systems. For those of you that like to do trap cropping, one of the most widely used trap crops is Blue Hubbard. The beetles love maximas. Blue Hubbard is one that we can recommend safely, because opposed to some others like a Turk's turban squash, they're not known hosts of bacterial wilt, which will be coming up next. And so that's a good place to attract the beetles, and then you can remove them, spray them, vacuum them off, however you prefer to control. Some people use treated seeds for that Blue Hubbard, and then they can avoid having like sprays on the rest of the crop that they're giving to their customers. So those are some options. Golden zucchini, these are so highly preferred, the beetles will eat them equivalently to the maximum, which means you cannot protect your many zucchinis with a maxima. You can, however, use golden zucchinis to protect your other summer squashes and your moshadas. So there's some hierarchies we can help people work through if they're looking at what should they do if they're using a trap cropping approach. Right. One of the biggest issues with cucumber beetles is that they bring in, besides eating the plants, they bring in bacterial wilt. They might also bring in some viruses that you won't see until the plants slow down as they're setting fruit. You can have it in the field in different parts of the country. You definitely see it in the field. I've only seen it on farm to a reasonable extent, a major extent, in two places: high tunnel cucumbers and maxima squash in the field. Some of the best solutions are to control the beetles, but in cucumber, there is a genetic resistance. We've been starting to work with some growers on this. So in a high tunnel, it's especially pronounced. So at Cornell, we have these Gothic high tunnels. The plants are not especially crowded. They have these end wall vents. And so these tunnels are really, really dry. We'll get powdery mildew, whereas a lot of our neighbors won't. But we don't get downy mildew. If you're growing tomatoes, you probably won't get late blight, any other diseases that require a lot of moisture. A Gothic high tunnel with these gabled ends and those gabled end vents can be run really dry, and that can prevent they can really reduce any of the diseases that rely on moisture. On the flip side, it's so dry, bacterial wilt is a disease that clogs up the vasculature of the plants. It only takes a couple cucumber beetles inside your tunnel, even if it's screened and the size and end walls like you see here. If a couple get in, you can still have a lot of problems. But cucumbers with genetic resistance to bacterial wilt, they don't get those kind of funky, pasty, sticky flavors, and they live. So that's the strips of green you see amongst all the wilted plants. A lot of the growers, myself at home, I have caterpillar tunnels, and there you have a lot more humidity. We pack in a lot more plants, and so there's not as much of an issue with bacterial wilt, but it can still be a big one. One of the other issues that we usually see in these wet tunnels is alternaria. It can be confused with downy mildew, shows up late growing season, similarly to when the downy mildew might be arriving. There are resistant cucumbers around. Some of the resources are migrating, but if you would like to see all the disease resistances that are available to you and all the cultivars that are commonly available to you, the resource sheet's moving, but if you search vegetables, Cornell resistant fact sheet, you will get lists of varieties that have different resistances to different diseases that you can sort through. One of the ways to help use this is if you grow some varieties with the resistance and it cures your problem, well then on the farm scale, you probably have it solved, at least solved for now. Also, if you're early in the disease cycle, sending a sample into a diagnostic lab to get checked out right as the disease is starting is a great way to find out exactly what that is. Later, if you wait until the plants are dying, there'll be this whole menagerie of things growing on the dying plants. So you really want to get that early sample in. Right? So an example here from a grower tunnel, caterpillar tunnel, really wet and hot in here. You can see down the middle, there is one cultivar, as we set up this trial for them to scout out what might work for them. Was a Bait Alpha. It's one that's really popular for high tunnels in the Northeast, greenhouses, and many other areas. The early yield is fantastic. It's cold tolerance. It's fantastic. Once the striped cucumber beetles and alternaria are around, it's not the crop to be growing. You can see it's just blitzed down the middle of the tunnel. It's a combination of alternaria and bacterial wilt together. The bacterial wilt, the plant's just going to shut like an umbrella. Wilt, pretty pronounced. The alternaria, the symptoms are here, and it will look like downy mildew to a lot of people looking at the cucumber, but you won't have that black sporulation on the other side of the leaves. And for us, I use the Cornell Diagnostic Lab to figure out exactly what it was And then that let us switch to alternaria resistant cucumbers. All the Marketmore cucumbers tend to be resistant. And so for the grower, as he's moving into this portion of the year and trying to grow a late crop of cucumbers in August, doing them in high tunnels because the downy mildew is going to take out the open field crops, and there's just a market for cucumbers because people are stopping to grow them then. So getting that right cultivar that can work in a high tunnel with these much more North Carolina type pests and diseases in the greenhouse is critical. Okay. I get a lot of requests, and then moving later into August when powdery mildew moves in, for powdery mildew resistant cucurbits. They're out there. Again, check those fact sheets. There's so much powdery mildew resistance. Often you can make a transition to a different crop, different cultivar within your crop that really addresses this. That's not to say that the powdery mildew resistant squash are always the way to go. After you've grown on your farm a couple of years, you know when powdery mildew is going to move in. And so all those early successions of zucchinis and summer squash, most growers we work with prefer susceptibles because all the priority in improving the crop is put on earliness, yield, fruit type, etc. So anything that you're harvesting from May to mid-August, that can be powdery mildew susceptible. You will not have any issues with the powdery mildew moving in and attacking that crop. And one of the only thing would be if you need to find different crops to change through the season. We see a lot of people growing something like zucchini elite early on and then switching to a zucchini like Dunja later in the season. The dynamics of your summer squash and winter squash can come into play here. If you're getting a winter squash, you're getting in the ground going in May and you're harvesting it in early September, the vines are already starting to die back then, the fruit are grown and they're matured, you're harvesting ripe fruit. If the vines are dying then, it won't really be that much of an issue. If you have a long season Moschata, if you're growing honey nut, for example, that's one where that is a concern. And also if you're planting going into the field like in June, so you're harvesting your winter squash, in October, you might see a quality issue in the squash. Around here, we've experienced every other August tends to be really wet and cold. We're out there with jackets in August to do our work. And so with that, the plant growth slows down, the powdery mildew really moves in, it's an issue. And so when people are getting some good control with Quadris on the conventional side, some treated seed you're already covered. Otherwise, one of our favorite go-tos are some of the soaps like MPED. They can give us really good control for us in powdery mildew. Right? But if you have that winter squash crop that is just brewing powdery mildew and you go to plant a late succession of your summer squash next to it, you will have huge problems instantly on your summer squash. And so we really recommend is switching to a powdery mildew resistant late season crop. And really that's all I would grow for a summer squash based on disease pressure that we have around in our area. Okay. One of the ones that comes in about the same time, cucurbit downy mildew. Powdery mildew is that white powdered sugar look. It's pretty unmistakable. It affects all the cucurbits. Maybe your peas and some other crops will get it. It's different powdery mildews, but within all the cucurbits, it's the same. Downy mildew, also within the cucurbits, it's mostly the same. You might be getting it on your spinach, your basil, your sunflowers. It's a different downy mildew. It won't transfer between the types of crops so broadly. Within the cucurbits, there's a squash specific aggressive strain. It's rare in New York. We've had it once to a big degree though. But otherwise, cucurbit, the cucumber strain of downy mildew, it's the most successful growing on cucumbers. The symptoms are really telltale. You see this leaf here. The easiest way to really confirm it is what it is, once you see that mosaic on the top of those grids, like a virus mosaic, but on like looking at your airplane window at like Iowa flying over in the summer, you see different fields at different stages. If you were to put that leaf in a wet paper towel and a Ziploc bag, leave it sit out, put it in the fridge overnight, underneath the yellow areas, if you see a purplish black, those are the downy mildew spores it's got its name for. That's how to really tell. And cucumber is pretty obvious. The resistant cultivars out there, this is a challenge to navigate what's out there because the resistant cultivars aren't really labeled in the most effective way for you, because downy mildew wasn't an issue until like 15 years ago when the disease evolved. It came back with a vengeance, started wiping out everything, and you see a lot of historical resistance, not whether it's resistant to the current strain. Some interventions we see in high tunnels, if you can keep it dry, downy mildew can't complete its life cycle. We only see downy mildew in our high tunnels around the end walls and the side walls where you get it blowing in onto the crop. And we've seen some pretty good control with some of the soap type sprays. Zonix is a fun one, and as it makes the spores explode. And so it's a cathartic way to control the downy mildew, and it will extend, especially if you're growing. For most of us, where if you're up here in New York and your growing season is going to be cut short by frost, it will help get you through to the end of the season. Right. If you've tuned in from other parts of the country, other parts of the state, there's maps so you can see when downy mildew is moving into your area. It's fine to report and help people track what's there. There's no encouragement to destroy your crop, etc. It's just coming. We want to know where it is. Every year, as the plantings move up from Florida towards New York, as the season gets warmer, the plantings move up. So does the disease. There's also an epicenter that's people are working to best explain, where you see it around Ontario, Michigan, and into Western New York initially. And then most of New York gets it both from the Ontario, Michigan, getting carried along by the jet stream, as well as there's the plantings moving north and tropical storms. Long Island gets quite a bit. Northern New York, either no one's reporting, so we don't know it's there, or it's not there. The disease rarely gets into the New England proper. So it's just this area on the East Coast that really has to worry about cucurbit downy mildew, and you only have to worry about it when it's going to show up. So this system tracks when it shows up. You can see when it shows up if you're just starting a new farm, see where it shows up in your area, or you can get alerts on your phone to see when it is like a county over within 100 miles of you, and when should you make sure to have that Zonix on hand, or whatever interventions, thinking about your harvest or your successions. Maybe that's just your cue to move on to another crop for fall. Maybe it's spinach time. We are working a lot on breeding for resistance, and we have quite a few lines that have some promising resistance. We're getting picklers and slicers in the Vlasic, Eureka, Excelsior range, and also some slicing cucumbers that are really similar to Dasher, being like a market more type. Okay. So examples of the resistance that's out there. So if you look at some of the resistance from the Cornell release lines, we have some that are ready to come out, and we get the third generation of resistance. Across the top is what we consider resistance. Straight 8 at the bottom is susceptible without resistance, and you'll see some cucumbers labeled with resistance that you might not view as resistant on your farm. Meg McGrath down in Long Island did a study, and so for the Cornell resistant cucumbers, I don't recommend planting them any time of the year when you don't have downy mildew. It's not going to help you out. If anything, it's going to be a mediocre cucumber at best. There's a lot of others that are for the non-downy mildew times of year. Non-downy mildew high tunnels, grow those. They're going to be better. If you want to plant a crop and be harvesting in, kind of this early September area when downy mildews may be really strong for you like it is for us. Meg McGrath did a study about planting into a downy mildew pressure time of year. And so you can see the measure of the disease is this AUDPC, this area under the disease progress curve. So a higher number is more disease. The DMR 401, which is the one I would recommend, 264, you'll see it doesn't do well in New York. It does great in Southeast. But you'll see it has a really low disease. And then if you look at the marketable fruit, because the plants are alive, you'll see it's the one that is also like out yielding everything. So going into a really strong downy mildew time of year, you should use the strongest resistance. Another time, you don't need this. If you are coupling this with an intensive conventional fungicide regime, you probably also don't want this. You want something that has a little bit higher yield without disease pressure because you're creating that environment with the spray. For organic growers in the field, I think these, in our experience, would be your options. And then the last end of the season, you're finally getting to harvest a winter squash. Some of the challenges we deal with, if you have black rot, wondered why is black rot in storage, you'll see this progression. Here's some fusarium also moved in, but this black sporulation, this is something if you leave it in the field, if you don't rotate, if you get seed that are contaminated with this, it's easily seed transmitted. This is a fungus. There's fungicides that are effective on it, so it's easier to control in essence in the alternaria. The peroxide washers are still really effective. You might have this scabby petrified wood look in storage. Once the squash starts to sporulate, you get the blackening. So avoiding is the easiest way. Otherwise, the most resistant squash we found in our trials is the variety Tiana, and that is the most resistant. Okay. One of our releases, a legacy of us at Cornell, teamed up to work on honey nut. Honey nut, as you think about like that beyond harvest into storage, honey nut tends not to be really strongly affected by black rot, but it also has a really thin skin. It will start to turn raisiny if you cure it, if you try to store it too long. It's something we handle and manage a lot like a delicata squash. So that thin skin, use it earlier, is one of the easiest ways to manage it. There are other squash, if you're going to be curing in your high tunnel, it's really hot, wanting to store in semi-controlled conditions for a really long time. One of our butternuts that we've improved for those purposes over honey nut is brulee. You'll also see Robin's Kogi nut and Autumn Frost. They have great storage. We haven't found as many problems with black rot in those, and they store this really well. They don't dry out, or if they do dry out, well, they're a pumpkin, and so it's not the edible flesh part, the meat of it that's drying out. It's the seed cavity you're going to scoop out anyway. So that is kind of our recipe for mapping out our season of challenges with cucurbits and looking how you might match different varieties, resistances, different market classes into that time course. To touch on a bunch of some of the other crops, with peppers, the three choices, bell peppers is an established market. You're never going to be quite as early as if you're growing the elongated sweets. With hot peppers, there's a lot of diversity available. Almost always you need to cut the nitrogen, reduce the soil organic matter where you're planting these. Otherwise, you can end up with huge plants with no fruit or just green fruit at the end of the season. And so we find this commonly in organic conditions with habanero types, serranos, a lot of peppers that are less related to bell peppers. You really have to watch the nitrogen. The elongated sweets, they're not that classic market standard as the bell, but they are often the earliness. We see them sold in these little Quartz containers where there's a mix of color. They can be sold for higher prices. They're easier to snack on when people get them home. They're higher yielding, they're earlier. The science behind it is you've grown cherry tomatoes and slicer tomatoes. You know the cherry tomatoes, abundant, small, they come on hard and early in the season. Peppers and tomatoes share the switch. There's one gene that I had the opportunity to be part of a study and figure out if it holds true for tomatoes and peppers. And yeah, so within cherry tomatoes, there's basically a switch that's determining, is pushing, it's a nudge, like a dimmer switch, pushing you towards small, early, abundant fruit versus taking a bit longer to get fewer large fruit. And so if you're growing with peppers, it's just a trade-off, based on your market. But once you avoid, say, well, we're going to embrace these small peppers. What can we do? There's a lot of variation. There's lots of things you can do with peppers once you don't need to have them be a 4-lobe cube. So there's some variegated peppers that will be new on the market from us in the spring. And so you'll see them all named after artwork that combines artwork from a variety of sources. And so these will be available, in seed catalogs. I think they're starting this winter. If you are growing bells, we've been making some progress. The first of these will be available soon commercially. Crimson Carilion is one of these lines. What we were trying to do is get people a blocky bell that would be similar to like Red Knight, some of the things that's come in from other countries or the West Coast or Florida, because with Ace, Ace is high yielding. You can see the marketable fruit and yield per plant is quite good. The issue is the length width ratio. It's kind of long. So anything that's a perfect length width ratio of 1 would be this perfect cube. And also it tends to have 2 or 3 lobes. So what we were doing is combining Ace with a really blocky, super blocky bell. And we started to release a series of peppers that have a similar earliness to Ace. The first bell, we're picking them. The first red bell, again, we put things in the field in June. So this would be, if you're putting stuff in earlier, this will be earlier. And some that are really kind of a really good cube that tend to be 4 lobes without sacrificing any of the quality. And if you're one of the folks challenged by Phytophthora, we've been releasing bigger blocky bells. You'll tend to find these in the hybrids you might be growing, but getting a nice blocky, really high resistance to Phytophthora. But also in this work with Chris Smart and her group that specializes in looking in Phytophthora and the population dynamics in New York State, some of the varieties with intermediate resistance to Phytophthora are plenty. And so if you're going by advice from New Mexico, California, Florida, New Jersey, they have really aggressive Phytophthora strains. They can be overkill for the issues we have in New York. And so Chris's group and some other extension specialists near you can help guide you to what's maybe the right level of resistance. But if you're not getting it with what's available commercially, we're glad to send samples for you to test out. Okay. Another thing we're working toward in peppers is mechanical harvest. There are some less expensive units. We're dabbling with making some. These all work on having some bars or some implement that comes up alongside the plant, and just that lifting of the fruit, you can snap them off. So working with plants that have this really tree-like architecture with plants that we know can be just loaded with fruit. And so I think this is going to be something we're excited to look at as a way to, you can really do these conical types, that is the elongated types that's tricky with bells. Right. In some other crops, we've been working with putting color back in edible potted peas. You'll see the reason this wasn't common, even though if you're growing cover crop peas, your Austrian winter peas, if you take a look at those all have purple flowers. because that is, you're seeing just a manifestation of all the chemistry the plant has that gives it all the cold and heat stress resistance, a lot of insect pest resistance, but it can also be associated with bitterness in the pods or the seeds, astringency. Some of the purples, if you were to chew on them and hold them between your molars, you'll get this dry sensation. These are just an awesome kid-friendly crop, so you don't want the kind of that red wine tanniny sensation in your peas. So working with these peas, one of the things that we've found with our varieties, might be true of others too, is with the heat stress resistance you get because the plant's full of all these other flavonoids and chemicals, you have plants that tend to be able to do much better into the heat of the summer. And so getting into fields later can still be a benefit with these. We're also looking at the antioxidant nutrition. These are also can really take your snow peas and make them add a little bit of wow. And so some of these are available from our program, and you'll also see some other colorful potted peas from others. Okay. And into pole beans, our last crop example. One of the things that I'm became really excited about is I got introduced to a fresh shelling bean a couple years ago. In a pole bean, you can have this continued harvest of beans that are at this stage, just as the pod starts to get limp, this edamame stage, I call it. We see them sold shelled or in the pods. And what we've been really excited about is with this crop, the ability for many growers to get a premium for the crop. So they're growing beans, which is good for the soil, they're nitrogen fixers, and especially in high tunnels where you get a buildup of salt in the soils from the nitrogen fertilizers. With beans, you can give the summer a break. You can also, if you're just growing cucumbers and tomatoes, you can give your diseases a break. You can grow a crop without continuing those diseases, adding excess salts that don't get rinsed out to that very dry environment that gets salt increases otherwise. And the economics and the ergonomics, I think, work. So being able to stand upright, taking these beans in clusters, and then getting a price premium in this extended harvest is something that we're piloting. And one farm has embraced this in a big way. Other farms are trying it on. The benefit to the customers is, unlike a dry bean that they have to soak, cook for a long time, these come out of the pods ready to go. We always instruct people just the first time, just try to simmer them in some salted water or chicken stock, and in 10-15 minutes, easily, many of these are done. And so it's a really fast, new vegetable. They retain, we're looking at how much more nutrition they retain if you're going to be cooking them for a shorter period of time. And the labor, one of what we've worked with this fall, it was great for dry beans. We have a well-born rotating fingers drum machine for about $1,500 that can do a bushel of peas in like 30 seconds. So that's a great way to add dry beans. For the fresh shelling, so the snaps you don't get picked on time, maybe they continue on to dry beans for you, but also there's some varieties that we're coming out with that work great in all three categories. And to be able to process them, we put handfuls through this Taylor pea sheller. Here it's doing limas. It works great for a lot of beans. And we found that this product, it'll need to be frozen if you're going to keep it longer than market, but it is a fantastic way to be able to get a lot higher value for the beans you're growing on your farm. Okay. So covered a lot of examples in crops, the cucurbit focus, some areas where there's some new things, cultivars coming out that can probably help you in the market. But also, I have experience with some tomatoes, and limited with overwintering winter greens. But tomatoes, we can speak to that a little bit. That's a bunch of folks to thank for helping us get all these studies together to share with you. And thank you for letting me be part of your vegetable planning for next year. Thanks. I'd be happy to take any questions from the chat, and we can see what we have to talk about. Thank you.
All right, not seeing anything in the chat just yet, and we may have messed up the chat. I know that happened last night. So if anyone has a question and is unable to use the chat, feel free to unmute and ask your question. I know, tell us a little bit more while we're getting some questions about your seed company that you co-founded.
Yeah, well, I work with a lot of seed companies in the region. A lot of our varieties get out there in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of them maybe in your area and ones to take a look at. But within row 7, one of the things that we specialize is in looking at the varieties that are a unique fit in the marketplace, are flavor focused, and the seeds are grown organically and in the US. But there's so it's one company with one set of offerings, and I encourage people to look at a lot of the companies in the Northeast. Many of them are mentioning when they have like Cornell material, and so that's one of the ways to see you're getting some of the latest disease resistance adaptations, and some of our seeds and genetics go into a lot of other crops. Hybrids, they might not mention it, but so I think sample broad.
Fruition seems to be a good source for Cornell varieties.
Fruition has so many Cornell varieties for sure, and they've tested them to make sure that they're working for them in the Finger Lakes, and so I think that's important too. But there's a lot of seed companies coming in. I think just to speak about the importance of these new seed companies is you have otherwise a lot of seeds that were in the Northeast, especially if you look at a crop like peppers. Companies are breeding for the biggest markets, and so you get a lot of attention for Florida and California. You get a lot of disease packages for all the bacterial issues in Florida. And you get sun scald resistance from California. And then when those come up into New York, they tend to be later than we'd like, and just a different set of priorities. And so it's great to see people focusing on priorities for the Northeast, for New York, and crops that really will help our growers get the most without those other priorities for other growers.
Excellent. And tell us a little bit about your celebrity chef experience.
Oh. So with one of the challenges folks often have, and one of the best illustrations is probably the tromboncino squash, whereas I went to growers in the Southeast about striped cucumber beetle resistance in the summer squash. One of the things that they said is, oh my goodness, we'd just love to be able to have more of a market for tromboncino squash because that's just naturally resistant. We can grow that all day long, but we just struggle with the market for it. And so I would say for anyone working with chefs or restaurants, they have a special opportunity to be able to grow things that a chef can use to distinguish their menu, to be able to celebrate a special connection, to name the farm, to showcase those relationships, and an opportunity, and have something that's really tasty and maybe used in a different way. That connection with the chef can help get it there. And so for the tromboncino squash, one of the best things to help get it there in the marketplace is, chefs are going to be using new ingredients. They're going to be chasing things down, new flavors, new dishes, new ways to prepare things. And so finding something you can introduce to them that's new is a great way to get one of those like best kind of pull through approaches into the marketplace. Tromboncino squash you use differently than zucchini. They like to be treated like meat. And so if you grill them, if you use savory approaches, they shine. The chefs are just a great ambassador for the new things you're trying to do on your farm. And so it can be a great way to start to introduce something new you're doing. And also to be able to point to recipes where people can taste it to then get them to come back. And so when you have your crops at market to highlight that. But there's a lot of great flavors out there, a lot of things that probably people are growing for themselves, that they're just, oh, this is delicious, and wish all the customers at the market could see it. So just that chef collaboration is a great way to start to introduce that.
Excellent. Any other questions, comments? Oh, okay. Bernice would like to know which squash was the most meat-like.
Meat-like. Oh, if you're going to have the most meat-like squash, it's the tromboncino squashes. The best way, and so you harvest them like a zucchini stage when they're still tacky on the skin. You want to get them before it gets slick. That's when it starts to like harden up and the whole texture of it changes. We slice it lengthwise. You can chunk it up smaller. You add some salt or brine it quickly, you rinse that off, and then put that on the grill. And especially kind of along with some meat, it really takes up those flavors, but also just some olive oil. It's the ultimate, those are the ultimate grilling squashes for sure.
Wonderful. Any other questions, comments? Quiet group today.
I've got some feedback here that it was very informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I spend a while. I'm not in the field as much with my extension hat, but we do get around. Also, if there's people that are interested in trying new varieties, there's one search engine we'd commonly recommend. It's having some issues right now. pickacarrot.com would be like this great Google for seeds. You can see where things might be in stock, if they're out of stock in your favorite source, your usual source, you might get a new favorite. And those Cornell vegetable disease resistant fact sheets give you some good examples of what other crops you might try that might have resistance to some of the issues you're having on your farm.
That is very good to know, because Johnny's is out a lot of my favorite peppers this year.
Yeah.
Lunchbox, selling out like crazy.
There's, with all the push for the home gardening, a lot of people bought a lot of seed. For a lot of seed, the tricky part is that usually a seed company will be growing one set of the varieties every year, and they might cycle through everything to restock over 3 years. So something for people to be thinking about is making sure they can get the critical varieties early. Please ration, because other people might be wanting to do this too. You don't need to buy your 5-year supply. Everything's coming back. Things are coming up and bigger. But if people can look at how they want to ration, that's important. The other thing is people want to look at saving seeds. A lot of hybrids are really dialed in, customized to be like this perfect thing that you can know exactly what to do in, so uniform on your farm. A very fast way to combine a lot of disease resistances into one package. A hybrid, you can just one stitch and you have them. But looking at varieties where you can save the seed reproducibly on your farm, you probably don't want to save all the seed, because then you have a whole separate business going on within your already busy farm. But looking at what are the crops you really can't do without, and looking at making sure you have some where you're set up, or a neighbor, a farm friend, you can maybe set up a co-op where you're saving some of these critical seeds, because it's still going to be another probably year at least before some of these companies get all their stocks back. And if demand keeps rising for seed sales, especially the garden seeds, that's going to be something that's going to be straining some of these supplies. So
yes, if you were saving something like a pepper or a tomato, would you need to put a little bag over the flower to prevent cross-pollination if you wanted to breed true, or are they pretty much selfing type?
They self, right? And so peas and beans self, no worries. The peppers, tomatoes, if you have them growing just side by side, you can get some crossing. And so that it'd be good to, if you plant some flowers and put your seed stock somewhere else, if you don't need a huge seed stock, a couple plants on your porch away from the pepper field can get you there. You don't need to produce thousands of pounds of seed. You don't need multiple rows of it probably, but saving seed, especially from the hots, even if they are crossing, you can get some cool diversity there and some signature hots perhaps. Something like squash is just something where they're easy. You can do a hand pollination on a squash plant, and the nice thing from that is you'll get 250 seed right there. So depending on your scale, it might be a couple of hand pollinations are enough to get you through, so you have some seed for next year, if you can't isolate. Right? So one of the main things with squash is knowing the species and not planting squash of the same species side by side. Same with peppers. If you're growing some habaneros, they really won't cross with your bells. But your jalapenos and your bells, they will.
Oh, no. Okay, there's two questions that I'm just going to ask them both at once. Number one, does your seed company have a catalog? And number two, could you repeat the website for the seed search engine? And maybe we can even type that in the chat box so everyone will have it.
Yep. And so the seed search engine is Pick a Carrot, all one word. And it searches a lot of sources at once. So it's a great tool for that. We, like I mentioned, so there's I helped co-found Row 7. There's a lot of seed companies in the Northeast we work with. So just a set to check out that might be having the seed that's right for you. Row 7's on there. Johnny's, Fedco, Fruition, Hudson Valley, Turtle Tree Seed, and even Harris Seeds is up here in New York with a nice organic and conventional selection. So apologies for anybody I left out in there, but I think that's a good set. If you're looking for people that are having the seed with a mind towards what works for this region, that's a good lineup. If you are looking for some crops, other crops, two other maybe four other sources we use. So things from the Pacific Northwest also tend to transfer pretty well. They have a different set of crops. They don't, where it's not as, the winters are mild, and so they will be out pulling carrots in January. We need a jackhammer to do that in the Northeast. Their winters are mild, but also their summers are mild. And so you see some things that don't work. Like their tomatoes tend not to be things that would be competitive flavor wise for us, but it's for what gets them a harvest. But Osborne seed, territorial seed, and wild garden seed. Wild garden is
making it not work, but I have my territorial catalog right here.
And they tend to have similar seed from different breeders. They're more distributors than breeders. Wild garden seed for flowers and lettuces, amazing. And one of the go-tos for people looking for a cornucopia of things, and there's a lot of great seed catalogs popping up. But for the people that are looking at the newest, latest thing that people are going to be asking for, Baker Creek Seeds is online as Rare Seeds. They have one of the most curious collections, but also check out Cook's Garden. There's the Cook's section of Burpee that has some of those. So anyway, just a set of places if you aren't already checking some of these out. I think I might have forgotten high mowing. My apologies, high mowing, if I forgot that out, if I forgot that one. And you can, working with that set, you can really explore what's out there for you. Each catalog is having a different specialized area. And so I'd really recommend seeing which one speaks to your farm specialization, and then you get a seed supplier that can help meet you.
And I just want to once again thank Michael for joining us on this cold day and being here in the Catskills.